Harvey Johnson was born in Virginia as a slave back in 1843. Not much is known about his life as a slave. He didn't talk about it much, so it's kind of mysterious. But we know that he was licensed as a Baptist minister in 1872. And that is when he first came to Baltimore. He came to Baltimore to start his career as a Baptist minister. He became the minister at Union Baptist, which was a fairly small black Baptist congregation of about 250 people. Harvey Johnson, at this point not yet 30 years old, was apparently a pretty charismatic, compelling minister and a community leader and organizer. And the congregation grew quickly. People liked what he was delivering on Sunday and throughout the week. By 1875, the congregation had grown to almost 1,000 people. That is some rapid church growth. And at this point, they were too big for the building in which they had their services. And so Johnson led a fundraising effort where these black members raised $20,000 and opened a fabulous new church in 1885. When they opened the new Union Baptist in 1885, it became the biggest black church in all of Baltimore. When they moved into the new church, they had close to 2,500 members. And while building Union Baptist into this incredible community institution, Johnson also helped facilitate the creation of a whole bunch of new Baptist churches in Baltimore, all like offshoots of Union Baptist, ministered by guys who were protégés of Harvey Johnson. You don't need these for the story. What you need is a sense of so he's sort of putting in a black leadership class around Baltimore through the churches. And in a way, there's a kind of parallel to Gorman and Rosin installing these ward bosses, except all that works for anti-democratic purposes, and everything that Harvey Johnson's trying to do is for democratic purposes. To try to create a city in which all people have a voice and rights. His goal is not to drive white people from politics. It's a politics where everybody's included. So, Calvary Baptist opens in 1878, Trinity Baptist, 1888, Sharon Baptist, 1882, just all these new black churches popping up, all informally affiliated with Harvey Johnson's leadership. Also, here on the slide, I have his wife, Amelia, who, like a lot of black women, stayed out of the spotlight, but did incredible work. She had been born, actually I'm not sure, I don't think she was, her parents were from Maryland, and they had fled to Canada back in the 1850s after the Fugitive Slave Law. They were escaped slaves and feared that they'd wind up re-enslaved. So they had moved up to Canada, and that's where Amelia was either born and raised or raised. I think born and raised. So then she comes back to Maryland now that slavery's over and meets Harvey. They fall in love. She was a gifted writer and a community mobilizer. And as is so often the case, a lot of what the men of this era get credit for is backed by an incredible woman's effort who doesn't get her name put on stuff. And that appears to be the case here with Amelia, too. So Harvey, in 1884, found 2 white lawyers to sue the steamer Sioux. The steamer Sioux was a steamship owned by the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Richmond Steamship Company. You don't need the name of the company. It's a steamship company that, like all Maryland steamships company and railroad lines, discriminated against its black passengers. Now, when you bought your tickets, they might not know your race, and that was the case here. These 4 black women who were all sisters bought first-class tickets. And then once they get aboard the ship, they're not allowed into their first-class cabin. They wanted to sue, and Harvey Johnson helped locate white lawyers who were willing to take the case. Hey, why not black lawyers? That's right, because black people aren't allowed to practice law in the state of Maryland. So 2 white lawyers who were at least somewhat sympathetic or willing to take the paycheck, and the case makes its way to the Maryland Supreme Court, which is properly in this period referred to as the Supreme Bench, but it just sounds weird to me, so I always slip and call it the Maryland Supreme Court. So the case goes to the Maryland's High Court. See how I just got out of it there? And the court delivered a narrowly interpreted victory for the black women who filed the case and for Harvey Johnson. The standard that the court set was that it was, and this was generally the view at the time, it was permissible to separate people based on race on something like a steamboat or a train, as long as the separate accommodations were equal. And the lawyers presented plenty of evidence that where the sisters got removed to, the Stewarts, the 4 sisters, the second-class cabin that they got moved to was dirty and nasty and rats running about. It's not what I paid for. I paid for a first-class cabin. And so the court's ruling was not that black people had to be allowed to ride wherever they wanted to. It was the steamship company didn't meet its obligation to provide black people a separate accommodation that was equal. Of course, what Johnson most wanted, what the Stewart sisters most wanted, was a court victory that would say you can't treat passengers differently. And they couldn't get that. The next year, I think buoyed by the success of that lawsuit, Harvey Johnson created the Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty, or MUBBLE. The Mutual United Brotherhood of Liberty, which is usually just referred to as the Brotherhood, or the Brotherhood of Liberty. This included those minister protégés of Harvey Johnson's. P.H.A. Braxton, Garnett Walker, William Moncure Alexander, these guys who now headed these other really successful Black Baptist churches in Baltimore. He also drew in other community leaders in the years that followed, including Harry Scythe Cummings, who's right here in the front of this picture, which is taken a couple years later, and another figure we'll talk about later, Ashby Hawkins, who's right there. You can tell this picture's a little later because that's Harvey Johnson. Look at them white mutton chops he's got by that time. This is the first picture that he ever posed for. You can see he's younger. So the Brotherhood is formed 1885, and they believe in lawyering up. I mean, they are convinced that the way that black people are going to be able to claim their rights in Baltimore and Maryland is by getting the law, by getting the courts to agree that the law is already on their side. You know, these people in the Brotherhood had read the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. They're like, I don't think they should be able to get away with this stuff. I don't think steamships should be able to treat us like that. I don't think Maryland should be able to make laws that treat black people unequally when the 14th Amendment says equal protection of the law. This same year, 1885, the Brotherhood's goals overlapped with white reformers' goals in Baltimore. There were all these, the Supreme Bench, like the rest of Maryland politics, is dominated by the Gorman-Rosin machine. So they pick the judges who then get put on the Maryland High Court. The whole judicial system was corrupt, too. And there was this movement of lawyers, particularly in Baltimore, who were tired of going into Baltimore courtrooms and losing because they knew the judges had been paid off. And so the Brotherhood wanted a less corrupt judiciary, and so too did these white Baltimore lawyers. And the best way to think of it is that they organized for the same goal separately, which was to try to get judges elected to the Supreme Bench. I'm actually doing pretty good at it. Did you notice? I'm doing good at not saying Supreme Court. Trying to get judges elected to the Supreme Bench who would be impartial, more fair. And same year, 1885, they got a bunch of new judges elected to the Supreme Bench. Not that the court is now going to be like on black people's side, but it's less corrupt and unfair. And there was an immediate sign of that because later that year, with the new judges installed on the Supreme Bench, the court ruled, and this is Harvey Johnson's work too, the court ruled that black people had to be permitted to practice law in Maryland. That prohibition on black lawyers that had been in place since the 1870s, the Maryland High Court ruled, was unconstitutional. You can't do it. So now, Harvey Johnson must have been fired up. He's like, all right, we don't have to rely on white lawyers who may or may not be sympathetic. Let's get some black lawyers to work our legal efforts. Everett J. Waring here became the first black lawyer to argue in state courts. Later, in 1890, arguing a case that started in Maryland, he became the first black lawyer ever to argue in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Waring, now, he's the guy in the courtroom, but Johnson's the guy coordinating the strategies. They targeted this Maryland bastardy law. A bastard is an illegitimate child, right? Born out of wedlock. And under Maryland law, if a white woman was pregnant out of wedlock, she was legally obligated to identify the father. the whole purpose of this was that they wanted to make sure that that bastard, in the kind of cool-sounding term, that illegitimate child, that bastard, didn't become a burden upon the state. So they want to make sure that the father gets held responsible financially to take care of that kid. But under Maryland law, black women didn't have to, depending on how you look at it, identify the father. There were a lot of reasons for this. The biggest one, I'm convinced, is that there'd be too many cases where black women would identify a white man as the father. And, the white men who made the laws don't want to wind up in that situation in the courtrooms. While I think that was the biggest reason for the disparity in the law, the disparity then played into ideas about black women's promiscuity, their inherently sexual nature, and all this kind of stuff. But for the most part, the change in the law is to protect white men. They started filing lawsuits against this, and ultimately won a change in the law in a weird, kind of backwards kind of way, but they still got the law changed so that Maryland took the word white out of the law. So now black and white women were held to the same legal standard when dealing with a pregnancy out of wedlock. Next, they started pressing the Baltimore government to give black schools more resources, more opportunity. And in 1887, the city agreed to hire black teachers at black schools and to create a black high school. Remember, there had been no black high school at all. If you were a black student, your education ended at like 6th grade. Now Baltimore has a black high school. So they are feeling that, you can put legal pressure on these institutions and get victories for your people. Meanwhile, though, the Gorman-Rosin machine continued doing what they did, which was win elections.